How many psychological institutions are working day and night in different countries to fathom the riddles of human conflict, either individual or social? Not one country in the world spends a soul on investigating the psychological phenomena and motivation of war. Dr. EDWAR DGOVER 19311, group at the British Institute of Psychoanalysis, was among a growing circle of Western psychologists in the 1930s who believed the cause of war was to be found in the human mind. Identification of the instincts that made for war would, it was hoped, make possible a new psychology of peace, even if it meant, as one enthusiast suggested, psychoanalyzing much of the adult population. The ambition to use developments in the relatively recent discipline of psychology to answer the riddle of persistent warfare was the reason Einstein invited Freud to speculate on the answer. If Freud's insistence on an immutable death drive seemed a pessimistic conclusion, the search for more useful ways of linking conflict and aggression with the workings of the mind has continued ever since. In many ways, Freud was the wrong person for Einstein to ask. Psychoanalysts were focused on medical practice and clinical results for individuals with psychotic conditions, not for whole societies or states. In the 1920s, it was broadly assumed by the profession that its work was on the inner life of its small body of patients, not on the wider issues of the external world, including the etiology of war. Nevertheless, psychologists did see the horrors of the First World War as the point at which they ought to have something to say about the origin of conflict. Writing shortly after the outbreak of war in August 1914, the American psychologist Daniel Phillips dismissed the unimportant surface explanations for the war in favor of the deeper and real causes to be found in a perennial instinct for pugnacity. All history, he wrote, affords evidence of this smoldering war volcano. Freud, in Thoughts of the Times on War and Death, written in 1915, shared Phillips's view that there must be deep within men primal impulses for violence. He developed this idea after the First World War in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, in which he elaborated for the first time his view that all organic matter sought to return to its inorganic state, contrasting the pleasure principle with what he called the death drive. This bifurcation, he thought, explained how mankind could both love and hate, beginning with the relationship to the parents, which he termed the Oedipus complex, infant love for but also frustration toward the mother, love but also hostility toward the father. Aggression arising from this psychic tension was usually repressed by a sense of guilt, but could be mobilized in certain circumstances, as it had been in the recent conflict. Freud was nonetheless wary of applying this insight to analysis of the group rather than the individual, because he understood that the problem for any attempt to move beyond the level of the individual was the absence of clinical evidence. In 1939, shortly before his death, Freud hinted at the archaic heritage of human beings. The subject matter memory traces of the experience of earlier generations that could be applied to groups, even to nations, as they grapple with the death drive. But he did not develop any general psychological theory on the causes of war, which explains his half-hearted response to Einstein. The application of psychoanalysis to the wider issue of war was left to Freud's psychoanalytical successors, particularly in Britain, where in the 1930s, theories of aggression came to dominate over any interest in the pleasure principle. Because war was widely regarded as an act of collective insanity, psychology seemed an entirely appropriate discipline to explain it, and confronting the issue of war seemed an urgent responsibility for a science in its relative infancy.
No narrator dialog, close, button, Alt plus, narrator window, skip for now, button. New natural voices are available. Narrator now offers more. Scan, narrator window heading level 1. Welcome to narrator. This is narrator home, where you can get help, access your settings, and learn about new features. Narrator is a screen reader that describes aloud what's on your screen, so you can use that information to navigate your device. To start or exiting narrator. please, or to access your documents. Violence possible. Copyright the author, S. 2019 Lawrence. One. 2. Copyright, Earth. Khrushchev claimed that an anecdote from Khrushchev's memoirs illustrates his fascination with rocketry and his personal involvement in the relevant decision-making in contrast with the 1. 2. Copyright the author, S. 2000, email, lawrence.friedman@kcl. An anecdote from Khrushchev's memoirs illustrates his fascination with rocketry and his personal involvement in the relevant decision-making in contrast with the management of strategic innovation in the U.S. Khrushchev recalled that one of Russia's Earth. Khrushchev claimed that he drew on his experience as a coal miner and as a supervisor during the building of the Moscow metro to suggest that the missiles could be put into sunken covered shafts. After being told by his Earth. Khrushchev claimed that he drew on his experience as a coal miner and as a supervisor during the building of the Moscow metro to suggest that the missiles could be put into sunken covered shafts. After being told by his engineers that this wouldn't work, he let the matter drop. Some years later his son, Sergei, who was involved in the missile program, informed Khrushchev that he'd read in some American journal that the US had begun to replace launching pads with silos. He then felt able to give some orders. A program to dig sunken silos was initiated and completed after his retirement in 1964. Khrushchev's belief in the quality of his own insight into these matters inevitably led him into Khan. The indictment was delivered by General Zakharov in February 1965, with the emergence of rocket nuclear arms, cybernetics, electronics and computers, any subjective approach to military problems, harebrained plans, and super. 2. Thomas Wolfe described Khrushchev's policies as settling for a second-best strategic posture. 3. The enemy would be deterred by the devastation threatened by the nuclear power becoming available to the Soviet forces. Long-range rockets would ensure that the U.S. land-based rockets could not escape. Short-range rockets could be used to permit the reduction in Army manpower without any loss in. Our state has a powerful rocket technology. Given the present development of military technology, military aviation, and the Navy have lost their former importance. This type of armament is not being reduced but replaced. Military aviation is now being almost entirely replaced by missiles. We have now sharply reduced and probably will further reduce and even halt production of bombers and other obsolete equipment. In the Navy, the submarine. Hijusti. For the strategic rocket forces, Raketny Vojska Strategiczego Znaczenia RSVN, formed in 1959, came out well from this policy. Elsewhere it was less popular. The airmen were upset at the proposed replacement of the bomber by the missile, while the Army and Navy were distressed by Khrushchev's determination to cut back their manpower. Their opposition resulted in some leading Soviet commanders being relieved of their posts. By and large, the military response to Khrushchev was not to contradict directly his theses, but to qualify them gradually. On the same day that Khrushchev spoke to the Supreme Soviet, Defense Minister Marshal Aryat Malinovsky explained how all arms of the Soviet armed forces would be retained in relevant and sound proportions. The emphasis on combined arms soon became the hallmark of the military traditionalists. Each branch of the services provided patient accounts of its growing importance. The ground forces argued that, because of the possibilities for attrition with increased, a rocket-carrying aircraft can be considered the successfully execute the combat mission. Only rocket-carrying aircraft possess these qualities. 5. An internal debate was conducted in the top-secret journal Military Thought. Here leading Soviet generals recognized the importance of missiles for a Khan. 6. Khrushchev was naturally supportive of this position given his strong interest in reducing military expenditure. By contrast, the more orthodox and majority view was that nuclear use in Europe should only occur at the behest of local army commanders, if necessary, as part of a large-scale conventional attack. At this time, the mainstream Soviet conception of a military advance into Western Europe, RE-AF. 7. It was also argued that in the event of widespread nuclear use there would still be enough organized resistance, and attrition rates on the Soviet side would be so high as to require a large reserve of conventional manpower. In this view, the Soviets still needed to maintain large forward-deployed conventional ground and air forces. 8. Such was the disproportionate weight in favor of this traditionalist view that the revisionist approaches were marginalized. 9. In 1962 the military worked out a shared position which was presented in a volume edited by Marshal Sokolovsky, entitled Military Strategy. This major work 10. The work avoided controversy and read like a compromise document. It offered no clear priorities for the design of Soviet forces while providing support for claims for every type of force. Nor was there even an unambiguous view on the likely character of a future war. Some passages suggest that it would be long, others that it would be short. At times the hypothesis of the inevitability of the expansion of limited war into a global nuclear war was given vigorous support, elsewhere there were indications that some limits might hold. Most div. This particular problem was exacerbated by movements in U.S. forces and doctrine, to which Sokolovsky and his team paid great attention. It was not only the suspicion of the military that caused Khrushchev's strategy to be quasi. Apart from a shared belief in the obsolescence of long-range bombers, the Americans and Russians appeared in 1961 to be diverging in their strategies. While Khrushchev contented himself with a minimum deterrent, Kennedy worried about the problems of securing a second strike capability. While Khrushchev spoke of the obsolescence of conventional armaments, Kennedy argued for extending conventional options. In addition, as once Khrushchev had gloated over his imminent missile superiority, the U.S. administration could now provide facts and this was diplomatically irritating and militarily alarming, for the combination of American missile superiority, the ability using satellites to Khrushchev had to take steps to retrieve the situation. Having bragged in 1960 that the Soviet Union is now the world's strongest military power, he could now claim only that the two powers were equal and warn the Americans against the presumption that they were operating from a position of strength. It was no longer asserted that Soviet casualties would be less than those of the United States in the aftermath of a nuclear war. The need now was to stress that both powers would suffer enormously. Khrushchev reported that President Kennedy had told him in their meeting in Vienna in early 1961 that the two sides were equal. With his comrades he sought to remind the Americans of this admission as reports came out of the Pentagon of a growing American superiority. Rather defensively, Marshal Malinowski argued in January 1962 that I hold that today the socialist camp is stronger than these countries' NATO, but let us presume that the forces are equal. We are ready to agree to this so as not to take part in stirring up a war psychosis. But since the forces are equal, the American leaders should come to correct conclusions and pursue a reasonable policy. 11. In the middle of 1961, during the Berlin crisis, the cuts in conventional forces were halted. As long-range bombers remain the largest single component of a small Soviet retaliatory force, the theme of their obsolescence had to be played down. To provide for the future, major new research and development programs were initiated. It was hoped that by building an anti-ballistic missile system comparable to the air defense system, much of the sting could eventually be taken out of any American attack. Development of space weapons was also encouraged, this still being considered an area where the USSR enjoyed a technological lead over the US. None of this solved Khrushchev's immediate problem. To compensate for his relative lack of long-range delivery vehicles, he was forced to a number of expedients. The Western Europeans could be hostages to American good behavior. C. L. Sulzberger of the New York Times reported in September 1961, after interviewing Khrushchev, that Khrushchev believes absolutely that when it comes to a showdown, Britain, France, and Italy would refuse to join the United States in a war over Berlin for fear of their absolute destruction. Quite blandly he asserts that these countries are 12. During the Berlin crisis, pointed references were made to the vulnerability of U.S. bases in Europe to nuclear attack and the disaster this could mean for the host countries. A second feature of Khrushchev's response was to emphasize the ferocity of the explosion of each nuclear warhead rather than the number of individual explosions that could be achieved. The terror quotient was exaggerated with talks of bombs of immense megatonnage, even up to 100 million tons of TNT. A test series began in September 1961 that included, among other high-yield tests, the notorious Tsar Bomba of 56 megatons. This was all despite the fact that the damage achieved by such weapons would not be substantially greater than that achieved with weapons of 5 to 10 megatons, and that there were no existing means of delivering such payloads. The Americans were reminded that any idea of the Marshal Malinowski chided the Americans for underestimating the damage the USSR could in 13. In the event, the largest yield ever employed on a Soviet ICBM warhead was 25 megatons. The matter was taken more seriously by Soviet strategists. The targets attacked would be the most important, which, it was made clear from another part of the book, were strategic nuclear weapons located well away from theaters of military operations. Unless these weapons are destroyed or neutralized, it is impossible to protect the country's vital centers from destruction, and one cannot count on successfully achieving the aim of the war even if the enemy troop formation deployed in the military theaters are destroyed. 14. The logic of this line of argument led to some sort of preemptive attack policy. It was not one explicitly reached in this book, despite the hints. Nevertheless, there is evidence that this logic was at least partly followed. The policy adopted in principle was that of launch-on warning. With timely warning of an incoming attack, the retaliatory force could be launched in time to avoid its own destruction. In November 1967, Marshal Krylov, Commander-in-Chief of the Strategic Rocket Forces, wrote, "An aggressor is no longer able suddenly to destroy the missiles before their launch on the territory of the country against which the aggression is committed. They will have time during the 15. At the time, however, this was no more than an aspiration. It took until the 1970s for the delays caused by the signing. The third rapid solution attempted by Khrushchev, which we considered earlier, was one that sobered by this experience, and now having to cope with increasing challenges from the Chinese Communists, Khrushchev embarked on a policy of détente, seeking to hold down American military strength through arms control, obviating the need for large-scale procurement programs in the USSR. After all that the military had been through with Khrushchev, the boasting and the bluster combined with a deteriorating military position and the humiliating climb down over Cuba, they became notably more hostile to his prescriptions for either force levels or the conduct of relations with the United States. In military newspapers and periodicals, the prospects for peaceful coexistence with the United States, and all that would entail by way of reduced military expenditure, were treated with skepticism. The main issue was over the extent of the American threat. To pave the way for a policy of peaceful coexistence, but there were precautionary or emergency measures that, if taken at the periphery, could save some lives. Of these, the most practical were fallout shelters. Nuclear fallout, the radioactive debris released from an explosion, could travel great distances and linger some time depending, amongst other things, on the prevailing weather conditions. A community apparently well out of harm's way might become the victim of a radioactive cloud. By waiting a number of days, and perhaps weeks, in a well-stocked shelter, people might escape this danger. In 1958, the Gaither Committee had advocated a fallout shelter program, only to have it rejected by the Eisenhower administration. Interest was revived with Kennedy. In terms of a desire to limit damage in the event of a nuclear war, a civil defense program was an obvious step to take. Furthermore, fallout shelters seemed a logical component of a city avoidance doctrine. If the enemy was good enough to attack only military targets well away from cities, then the main danger to the civilian population would be from fallout. In May 1961, Kennedy had decided to promote civil defense, if only to underline to the American people the dangerous times ahead. This involved public fallout shelters, advice on private shelters, and storage of food, medicines, and water. In July, when he spoke to the nation on Berlin, he emphasized the steps every citizen can take without delay to protect his family in case of attack. He emphasized that civil defense was not a deterrent to attack. Instead, he drew attention to the risks of an irrational attack, a miscalculation, an accidental war, for these could neither be foreseen or deterred. It is on this basis that civil defense can be readily justified. On this basis, he set in motion a nationwide long-range program of identifying present fallout shelter capacity and providing shelter in new and existing structures. 11. Kennedy's announcement encouraged a frenzy of activity, helped along by a national fallout shelter survey. Families prepared to outlast a nuclear catastrophe, construct shelters. 12. Administration of. Contrary to strengthening our resolve, we are seeing already the results of a civil defense program, people debating whether or not to have guns and use them against neighbors in order to keep the fallout shelters for themselves, communities and states discussing the need to have a special militia in order to exclude neighboring communities and states. 13. As work began to survey available space and authorize construction, it became apparent that this program would yield only limited banning. Not surprisingly, the necessary legislation in Congress made little progress and Kennedy's requests for funds dropped sharply. 14. In public and private, Kennedy dwelled far more on the lives that would be lost in a nuclear war than those that might be saved. The move away from a city's avoidance doctrine weakened the case for a shelter program. With a greater expectation that cities would be targets in a nuclear war, the value of the shelters diminished. Nevertheless, McNamara continued to advocate a shelter program, linking it to the lingering objective of damage limitation. The advocacy became more lukewarm as it became apparent that most defensive measures could be neutralized by the adversary without a great deal of trouble. Calculations suggested that for each level of damage mitigated, the defense had to spend 3 times as much as the offense. By 1965, the shelter program had been abandoned. 15. The power of nuclear weapons always seemed to mock attempts to protect human societies from their effects. Advice on how individuals might look after themselves provided rich ground for satire, from advice to men to turn down the brim of their hats to provide additional shield against the initial. 16. This sense that, whatever one did to improve the defense, the offense would soon regain its position with a much more modest effort, began to color the administration's attitude to all defensive systems. If both sides could be persuaded to accept the inevitability of the primacy of the offense, which meant that any investment in defense would be rendered futile by offensive countermeasures, they could save themselves a lot of money. It took time for this proposition to reach the center of political debate. Available systems suffered from technical disabilities, particularly with regard to radar, which allowed McNamara to procrastinate. In January 1964, Jack Ruina, Carl Kaysen, and Murray Gell-Mann presented a paper for a Pugwash conference in India explaining why defensive systems could be destabilizing. 17 They shared the paper with a senior Soviet scientist, who described their conclusion as a total absurdity as they were asking the Soviet Union to renounce attempts to defend its population. According to Gelman, the Americans were amused when he told them that if they renounced defenses, the Soviet government would not get a single vote at the next elections. They met the same man later that year who reported that he now thought the idea was not so crazy. 18 In late 1964, Jerome Wiesner and Herbert York came up with the American. It was in this journal that York and Wiesner published their article. The occasion was the Partial Test Ban Treaty of 1963 and the ensuing argument over whether underground tests could now safely be banned along with the atmospheric tests covered by the treaty. ABMs were one of the few systems assumed to require more tests as they destroyed incoming warheads by exploding a nuclear weapon in their vicinity. York and Wiesner demonstrated that no important weapons developments would be at risk, and in doing so provided a valuable summation for a non-specialist audience of the current state of the art in a variety of areas of defense technology. Their argument, however, went beyond advocacy of a comprehensive test ban to a warning that there was no technical solution to the problems of the vulnerability of the US, or the USSR, to nuclear attack, and that attempts by either side to. Paradoxically, one of the potential destabilizing elements in the present nuclear standoff is the possibility that one of the rival powers might develop a successful antimissile defense. Such a system, truly airtight and in the exclusive possession of one of the powers, would effectively nullify the deterrent force of the other, exposing the latter to a 19 They then explained why they believed such an effective defense was unlikely to materialize. With the potency of each offensive missile, no defensive failures could be tolerated, the missile defense itself would be vulnerable to attack, and the attacker would have all the tactical advantage of surprise, knowing when, what, and how to attack, while the defender would have to be on continual alert for all eventualities. Finally, there was a problem of lead times, the time taken from conception of a new system to its ultimate deployment. As the defense had to be planned against the known qualities of the offense, it started the race a lap behind. The argument against ballistic missile defense was thus reduced to two propositions: A, it would not work, and B, if one side was so misguided as to try to build one, this effort would stimulate an arms race. For most of the 1960s, McNamara was content to base his opposition to ABMs on proposition A. By 1966 this had become subject to quali. The promotion of the ABM gained even more force by the feeling amongst the military that the time had come to challenge McNamara on his whole strategic philosophy. They were distressed that few new weapons systems were being authorized and that McNamara was unwilling to prosecute the arms race with any energy. The Wiesner/York article became caught up in a general debate over whether military technology had now reached a plateau or whether there were to be more quantum jumps, and from that whether or not enough money was being spent in the Department of Defense on new projects. The thesis was denounced by the IN. 20 James Schlesinger, a future Secretary of Defense then at RAND, described the notion of a technological plateau as wishful thinking. 21 The issue became symbolic of other complaints and frustrations connected with his disregard of military advice and sensibilities. McNamara was faced with a recommendation from a United Joint Chiefs of Staff for a full-scale ABM system. He was forced to accede partially to this request and then left it ambiguous as to whether this was to protect U.S. cities against an incipient Chinese missile threat, that only materialized much later, or U.S. ABMs against a Soviet missile threat. 22 In announcing this decision in September 1967, McNamara provided an eloquent statement of his views on the dynamics of the arms race, in a manner which was to IN. The speech was a remarkable statement from an American Secretary of Defense, albeit one who was on his way out. He retired as Secretary of Defense in February 1968, his belated recognition of the folly of the Vietnam War having made his position untenable. This speech was therefore something of a valedictory. McNamara was not content simply to say that none of the systems at the present or foreseeable state of the art would provide an impenetrable shield over the United States, or to add that were we to deploy a heavy ABM system throughout the United States, the Soviets would clearly be strongly motivated to so increase their offensive capability as to cancel out our defensive advantage. He placed all this in the context of an overall view of the arms race. The situation described was one in which the arms race gained momentum unnaturally and irrationally. The adjective used was mad. Both sides sought nothing else but to preserve their assured destruction capability, and were so anxious in this objective that they planned for the future on the basis of conservative assumptions concerning the adversary's future intentions and capabilities. What is essential to understand here is that the Soviet Union and the United States mutually in. He then explained the recent history of Soviet and American force development in these terms, admitting that the Soviet build-up then underway was a result of the Kremlin's misunderstanding of the objectives of the US build-up of the early 1960s, which could have been seen as directed towards a credible. That was not, in fact, our intention. Our goal was to ensure that they, with their theoretical capacity to reach such a. The result has been that we have both built up our forces to a point that far exceeds a credible second strike capability against the forces we each started with. In doing so, neither of us has reached a. 23. Such a detached analysis from a Secretary of Defense gave the proposition a credence that it did not deserve. The action-reaction phenomenon was soon being cited as a virtual iron law of strategic relations by liberals in an effort to encourage restraint in U.S. policies. In this way they found themselves committed to the preservation of the balance of terror, rather than its elimination as had been the hope of many less than a decade before. Unfortunately, there was little evidence to substantiate either McNamara's analysis of the dynamics of the arms race or his reading of history. Had he made a more modest and general observation on the extent to which the two superpowers in. There were two main problems with McNamara's statement. First, the assessment of adversary intentions and capabilities were only one of a number of factors in. There were powerful arguments in favor of evaluating forces according to assured destruction criteria, but that did not mean that that was how it was always done. It was the fact that the Soviets did not see things this way that caused McNamara so much diff. The bad history and wishful thinking detract from, but ought not to obscure, the signing. The academic literature of the 1950s and 1960s. The role of ABMs in a duel with the offense had been identity. To McNamara, the superpowers could break out of the grip of the action-reaction phenomenon by refusing to react. If certain temptations could be resisted, then neither side would. However, because, according to the Pentagon analyses, even ABMs could not create a. McNamara's strongest support now came from those nuclear scientists who had long been at the fore of attempts to control and reverse the arms race. To these scientists, the most disappointing feature of the September 1967 speech was the appended announcement that an ABM system, known as Sentinel, would be constructed to protect U.S. cities against an attack from China in the early 1970s, indicating that McNamara had succumbed to the very domestic pressures from the military, industry, and his president's political opponents to which he had alluded. In these circumstances, the powerful liberal wing of the Scienti. Using Scienti. The 1-2-3 moved beyond their strictly Scienti. 24. But it was hard for the United States to abandon the illusion so long as the Soviet Union refused to let it go. McNamara had tried and failed to persuade the Soviets of the theory. In 1966, Soviet Prime Minister Alexei Kosygin visited President Johnson in Glassboro, New Jersey. McNamara was only given 15 minutes for what would have been a preview of his San Francisco speech, with an explanation of the dangers of a competition in defensive systems. Kosygin did not take it in, remarking only that it was the American offensive rather than defensive systems that gave him sleepless nights. 25. The Soviets continued to build defenses around Moscow, and Johnson did not see politically how he could fail to match a Soviet system with an American system. At the same time, Johnson wanted to get arms control discussions going with the Soviet Union. After the false start of Glassboro Suv. Footnotes: the McNamara Ascendancy, p. 311. In Thoven and Smith, How Much is Enough? p. 174. Ibid, pages 177-8. See also Friedman, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. Fred Ickel, Can Nuclear Henry Rowan, Formulating Strategic Doctrine. 25. Copyright the author, S. Herman Kahn spoke of this danger as one. This not only gave anonymity to the offending country but also suggested that the problems were similar whoever the nth power might be. A frequent observation, for example, was that whereas the nth power viewed its own acquisition of nuclear weapons as being fully just, Herman Kahn spoke of this danger as much as anybody. He shared the intuitive concern that the probabilities of disaster were increased as more countries gained access to nuclear capabilities and assumed that, in the absence of controls, this would soon happen. These new nuclear powers would need responsible governments and sophisticated forms of crisis management, especially if the small nuclear powers began. In a nuclear world, the small nuclear powers, vis-a-vis one another, would have greater opportunities for blackmail and mischief-making, greater likelihood of an accidental triggering of weapons, an increased possibility of a local Munich, a Pearl Harbor, and blitzkriegs, pressures to preemption because of the preceding three items, a tendency to neglect conventional capabilities because of an over-reliance on nuclear capabilities, internal, civil war, a coup d'état, irresponsibility, etc., and external, the arms race, fear, etc., political problems. 2. Kahn was less worried than others about the fear of catalytic war, in which a small nuclear power triggers off the cataclysm of a superpower nuclear war. The most extreme version of this notion was developed by Arthur Lee Burns, in which a minor nuclear power would devise a means to make one superpower believe it had been attacked by the other, so causing a nuclear war. 3. McNamara took this issue seriously. During the 1950s, the Eisenhower administration, while expressing concern over the possible spread of nuclear weapons, had sought to head off the problem by making the BANI. While there were no actual transfers of nuclear warheads to allies, a large number of tactical nuclear weapons were also made available under the double-key system of shared control by the US and the host country. Impediments to nuclear cooperation with the United Kingdom were removed by amending the McMahon Act, and there were tentative discussions over facilitating the development of nuclear delivery systems in France. In the last days of the Eisenhower administration, an offer was made by the US to create a NATO deterrent, a force of 300 Polaris missiles to be put under the control of the NATO Council, with the aim of reinforcing the deterrent while averting pressure for independent nuclear forces. Thus, whatever the doubts about the general diffusion of nuclear weapons, it was accepted that major powers within the alliance would want some access to nuclear capabilities, and that it was therefore best if this could be done in a spirit of sharing American capabilities rather than by a series of separate national initiatives. Doubts about the wisdom of this approach were expressed forcefully by Albert Wallstetter. He discussed 4 alternatives for NATO: reject all nuclear weapons, develop autonomous nuclear forces, develop a jointly controlled nuclear force, rely on United States guarantees. This latter option was the most compelling. He assumed that there was a coincidence of American and European interests, so an American response to an attack on Europe was credible. This did not need a certainty of response but only a high probability, which he assessed as clearly large. By contrast, the national strike forces held by allies would be extremely expensive. They would require a large initial outlay for the basic technology without the economies of scale available to a superpower. Their military value tended to be exaggerated by noting the damage they might in. If small forces were constructed, their vulnerability could encourage a hair-trigger response system to reduce the dangers of being caught before launching. In this way, the problem of forestalling deliberate attack is inseparable from that of preventing war by miscalculation. With the multiplication of national strike forces, the control problem becomes especially acute. If many nations have the power of decision, and if, in addition, each nation decentralizes its control to a multiplicity of subordinates, or worse, to some electronic automata, it is evident that the situation could get out of hand very easily. The European view assumed that deterrence depended on risk rather than certainty. They, no more than the Americans, wished to get involved in a nuclear war, but they believed that the possibility of such a war provided a powerful, and probably evident American doubts about the emphasis put in NATO doctrine on nuclear threats generated anxieties that some deterrent effect might be lost. It also raised the question of whether these smaller nuclear forces could add some deterrent effect. The starting point for McNamara's approach to all issues of nuclear strategy was that nuclear decisions should not be forced on a president by a lack of alternatives or a fear of surprise attack or an involuntary process of escalation. Every move that involved these weapons should be cool, deliberate, and to some purpose. These questions related less to who controlled the nuclear weapons than how they were controlled in their use. 5. The line of Wallstetter's argument was that by their very nature the smaller nuclear forces were incapable of controlled use. They certainly would be unsuitable for attacks designed to avoid cities. There was no scope for holding the enemy's population as a hostage by directing a. What our strategic plenty gives us is the ability to choose among alternative tactics, each of which poses so formidable a threat to Soviet interests that it is a compelling deterrent even where we impose severe restraints upon ourselves. Smaller and less sophisticated nuclear systems, in order to pose a serious deterrent, must promise to be used in as blunt and bloody a manner as possible. 6. Because McNamara felt that any strategic nuclear exchange would involve all the nuclear powers, he was appalled at the prospect that such an exchange might start in an uncoordinated way and involve the wrong mixture of targets. 7. This would be a likely result of nuclear proliferation within the alliance. Enthoven and Smith indicate another argument informing McNamara's critique of independent nuclear deterrence. It meant that fewer resources would go into British and French conventional forces. 8. In his June 1962 speech in Athens to NATO ministers, the same that was repeated a month later at Ann Arbor, Michigan, McNamara made his concern known in a triumph of logic over tact. Our relatively weak national nuclear forces with enemy cities as their targets are not likely to be safe. Meanwhile, the creation of a single additional national nuclear force encourages the proliferation of nuclear power with all its attendant dangers. In short, then, limited nuclear capabilities, operating independently, are dangerous, expensive, prone to obsolescence and lacking in credibility as a deterrent. 9. This damning judgment was directed, above all others, at the French. The British nuclear force was too well established to dislodge, although this did not prevent the British government from. Up to this point the British had taken for granted that they were effectively second in command to the United States in NATO and required no special justice. 10. The approach tended to approaches being adopted in the United States, preferring the more classical approaches derived from history, philosophy, and law. Little Bainey. 12. Liddell Hart, who had prided himself on his scientific. 13. British scientists who had developed operations research were concerned that far too much was being claimed by contemporary American practitioners. The operations research tradition was still present within government, However, their scientific. 14. Whatever the merits of their misgivings about the American approach, the British were left looking old-fashioned and out of touch. The intellectual community struggled to match the technical competence and resources of out. 15. The British debated with the Americans on the assumption that European security was a shared responsibility. Neither the need for some form of deterrence nor an alliance was questioned. Unlike in France, where intellectual stimulus was found by opposing the Americans, there was no comparable search for a European alternative to dependence on the United States. The main issue was what if any contribution a national nuclear strike force could make to wider deterrence. Nuclear weapons were proving to be expensive and technically troublesome. Could any British force make a signing? With the issue of the vulnerability of strategic forces too. Pressure for abandoning the British deterrent came from outside the political establishment. The intellectual case for nuclear disarmament was not normally presented in alliance terms. One attempt to do so described Britain's non-independent contribution to the total Western nuclear force, as being insubstantial and, moreover, unwanted. 16. Though the argument could on occasions be heard that there was no need for the British to contaminate themselves with such immoral things as nuclear weapons so long as the United States was willing to carry the burden, the arguments of the unilateralists went well beyond this, criticizing any connection with weapons of mass destruction. For example, Stephen Kinghall wrote that it would be an essential feature of the UND, unilateral nuclear disarmament, policy that we make it clear beyond all doubt to our American friends that in no circumstances whatsoever did we wish to be protected by, or in any way associated with, their nuclear capacity. 17. The unilateralists were thus not offering a better nuclear strategy for NATO. They were shunning nuclear weapons altogether. By contrast, the British government sought to get the maximum baiting. At that time, the memory of Japan's rapid conquest of the region was still prominent in the minds of policymakers, particularly in Australia, and fears were expressed of a similar Chinese conquest. To defend against this would require a forward conventional defense augmented by nuclear strikes on the invading Chinese armies or on China itself. 18. The problem faced by military planners was that to contemplate a forward defense and assess the level of forces needed required some knowledge of the nuclear capabilities that would be available. But in the mid-1950s, the US had been unwilling to share its nuclear plans with its SEATO allies. Britain, in particular, had been singled out for criticism by some senior American military of the problem of Chinese expansionism. 19. In 1957, Britain declared its willingness to maintain a nuclear capability earmarked for SEATO in the event of Chinese aggression. As late as the mid-1960s, as Britain contemplated maintaining a military role east of Suez, Prime Minister Harold Wilson promoted the idea of stationing a Polaris submarine in the Indo-Pacific. 20. The United Kingdom also maintained nuclear-capable bombers in Cyprus into the 1970s that were earmarked for use in the event of Soviet aggression against members of the Central Treaty Organization, CENTO. As with its military planning and thinking about nuclear use in Far East contingencies, the nature of its commitment to a nuclear defense of the Middle East was more about the value it provided diplomatically, as well as raising Britain's military pro. 21. In the high-priority theater of Europe, a variety of purposes were, at different times, identity. In terms of operational strategy, the British had always intended to develop and use their nuclear force in close cooperation with the Americans. In the late 1940s, the view was that a British force might be necessary to make up the numbers in a Western retaliatory force against the East. By the early 1950s, it was recognized that the United States could provide an imposing threat without Britain's help, but perhaps there might be targets of particular interest to Britain that might be neglected if the responsibility for the retaliatory strike was solely in American hands. In addition, British aircraft would then be needed in the diplomatic efforts were therefore devoted to encouraging interdependence with the Americans in nuclear matters rather than striving for independence. The rationales used to justify Britain's independent force were as much political as strategic, stressing the opportunities for the exercise of benign in the independent contribution gives us a better position in the world, it gives us a better position with respect to the United States. It puts us where we ought to be, in the position of a great power. The fact that we have it makes the United States pay a greater regard to our point of view, and that is of great importance. 22. After 1962, this argument was emphasized. Macmillan's successor, Alec Douglas Home, spoke of the bomb as a ticket of admission, providing a place at the peace table as a right. 23. This was the context in which the challenge posed by McNamara's Ann Arbor speech was viewed. It was complicated by the past and uncompromising British support for the strategy of massive retaliation which the Kennedy administration was now questioning. British critics of this strategy, such as Liddell Hart and Blackett, who favored a rebalancing of force structures in favor of conventional defense, found their main audience in the opposition Labour Party. 24. More seriously, If the US was so opposed to national nuclear forces, then it would be relatively straightforward to force Britain out of the nuclear business because of its dependence upon an American system to sustain the deterrent into the future. After plans for a British ballistic missile, Blue Streak, had been aborted, President Eisenhower agreed in 1960 to sell Britain the Skybolt air-launched missile, then under development. In return, the British agreed to make available a base for US nuclear submarines at Holy Loch in Scotland. The Kennedy administration kept the funding going, but with growing doubts about the missile's value, and with an understanding that if it was not warranted for US purposes alone, it should not be kept going for the sake of the RAF's V-bomber force. It was the administration's view that in the long run it would be for the best if the British got out of the nuclear deterrent business and devoted their efforts to conventional forces. The British got mixed signals about the prospects for Skybolt, but unfortunately they only chose to note the positive ones. 25. The program was beset with diff. 26. To salvage the situation, a hastily arranged summit conference was convened at Nassau between Prime Minister Harold Macmillan and President Kennedy. This resulted in a deal by which Britain was allowed to purchase Polaris submarine-launched missiles. This put the British force on a much sounder basis, given the reduced vulnerability of a submarine-based force. The agreement at Nassau stipulated that the UK Polaris submarines would be used for the purpose of international defence of the Western Alliance in all circumstances. In this way, the proposals could be a compromise between alliance integration and national independence. However, the agreement was unclear as to whether the alliance nuclear force to which Britain was contributing was to be constructed as a multilateral or multinational force. Moreover, it is, of course, only where supreme national interests are at stake that the question of whether or not to use nuclear weapons arises at all. Nevertheless, the underlying loyalty to the alliance forced the British to pull their punches when explaining the need for their own forces. There was a tension between the underlying commitment to interdependence within an alliance context and the demand for an independent national force. This was picked up in the Labour Party's 1964 manifesto. The Nassau Agreement to buy Polaris know-how and Polaris missiles from the USA will add nothing to the deterrent strength of the Western Alliance, and it will mean utter dependence on the US for their supply. Nor is it true that all this costly defense expenditure will produce an independent British deterrent. It will not be independent, and it will not be British, and it will not deter. Its possession will impress neither friend nor potential foe. 27. Yet when the Labour government came to power in 1964, it was reluctant to take the step of abandoning Polaris, and was advised of the Div. Own willingness to engage in nuclear war on Europe's behalf was open to doubt. 28. Without actually going so far as to directly question the US guarantee, the 1964 Statement on Defense diplomatically raised this point, if there were no power in Europe capable of in 29. This theory of a second decision center, which was French in origin, had the advantage of explaining the need for an independent national force without explicitly questioning the American nuclear commitment to NATO. It was still a delicate line to follow. There were problems in constructing plausible scenarios in which Britain stood alone yet still had the US furnishing the necessary support to keep the Polaris. Excessive speculation on how it might be possible to do without the US risked the prospect of Washington reducing its commitment to the alliance. Hence the need to argue that the danger was not of the US reneging on its nuclear guarantee but of a mistaken Soviet belief that this might happen, to be corrected by forcing it to worry about another center of nuclear decision. As the Polaris program turned out to be remarkably inexpensive, only modest justy. Within government, the challenge of the 30s for attacking Soviet cities other than Moscow, the requirements for minimum deterrence varied, usually in an arbitrary manner, from several cities to several dozen. As Michael Quinlan observed, logic suggested, and it was occasionally attempted, to start with the judgment of the deterrent required and derive force level from that. However, the governing methodology amounted to assessing what the existing or intended force could do and then considering whether that SUV 31. The decision to purchase Polaris placed limits on the amount of destruction that could be 32 Was it really necessary to con? 123 Obsolete. Britain thus became a staunch supporter of the 1972 ABM Treaty lest improved Soviet defences completely undermine the UK deterrent, though there was still a need to hedge in the event that the Soviets chose to break out of the treaty. 33 The Moscow Criterion also provided the rationale for the program to improve the penetrability of the Polaris SLBMs, known as Chevaline. Although alternative options existed, such as targeting a handful of cities west of the Ural Mountains, these were not widely circulated within the British government as knowledge of them would have threatened the justy. In the 1970s, with a looming decision on whether to acquire Trident, a more 34 Consequently, at the time of the 1980 Trident decision the government stayed with the rather cryptic formula used in the past which referred to targeting key aspects of Soviet state power, thus implying that Trident would be aimed at targets other than cities, although in practice these key aspects tended either to be in cities or close to them. 35 Footnote C, for example, National Planning Association, The Nth Country Problem and Arms Control, New York, NPA, 1959. A corrective to some of the pessimism on the subject is found in Fred Ickel, Nth Countries and Disarmament, Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, 16:10, December 1960. A useful compilation of articles is R. N. Rosencrantz, ed., The Dispersion of Nuclear Weapons, New York, Columbia University Press, 1964. Herman Kahn, The Arms Race and Some of Its Hazards, in Brennan, ed., Arms Control, Disarmament and National Security, p. 119. The Rationale of Catalytic War, Princeton University Center of International Studies, April 1959. 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Albert Wallstetter, Nuclear Sharing, NATO and the N+1 Country, Richard Moore, A Jigsaw Puzzle for Operational Research. See for example John Strachey. The text of the manifesto can be found online at Stoddard. Copyright the author, S. and Jeffrey Michaels 2. 1. The British saw an independent nuclear force as an insurance against the withdrawal of America's nuclear protection but certainly not a substitute. The French dismissed the U.S. nuclear guarantee as the British spoke only with circumspection about America's future reliability, as if embarrassed at questioning the scruples of a friend. The French pulled no punches when questioning America's nuclear guarantees. All this led the French, far more than the British, to question the dominant trends in U.S. strategic thought. By the time de Gaulle took power, the force de frappe was then already under development, prompted by the experience of being undermined by the United States during the 1956 Suez Crisis. De Gaulle turned the force into a central instrument of his own diplomacy. In doing so he was only marginally in. 2. De Gaulle is reported to have replied to one strategist who sent him a copy of his latest book that the analysis was all very interesting. There was, however, but one issue, SCEK la France restera la France. 3. He assumed that nuclear weapons were the major source and symbol of contemporary international power. When it came to the transition from atomic to thermonuclear weapons he was at 4. At the United States, via the continent, in a condominium Europe could get sold out and her interests forgotten. The tough line on French aspirations captured by the Ann Arbor speech therefore had high diplomatic costs for the Kennedy administration and in the end a low return. It might have been better to have helped France get its own force, on the grounds that it was a major power and would get its force eventually whatever the US did. In 1960, before Kennedy's inauguration the 5. Although unsympathetic to de Gaulle, Kennedy felt obliged to offer the same deal on Polaris offered to Britain to France. This was rejected by de Gaulle at a January 1963 press conference in which he ref. By this time French strategists, particularly two retired generals, Pierre Gallois and André Beaufort, were already making their case for a French nuclear force. In 1956 Gallois introduced some themes which became prominent in his later writings, including the consequences of unequal access to nuclear weapons. 6. Those with the weapons held the trump cards for an active policy. So long as their retaliatory capacity was secure, they enjoyed self-protection. Otherwise they could only hope that they were safe. Because of the uncertainty about the air nuclear power guaranteeing the sovereignty of Western Europe, there were reasons for doubt. Gallowis was well aware of the for hesitation. We are approaching the time when the menace will move faster than a mind can be made up. In 1960 and in 7 he was now concerned about the credibility of NATO's deterrent. His analysis of the dynamics of nuclear war itself was not uniquely deep or original. He had little con. In principle, a determined policy of deterrence could solve all Western military problems. If the potential assailant believed that even on the occasion of a con. 8. The problem was that Western nations were not made of stern enough stuff. Gallowis preferred retaliation so automatic that no unfriendly nation would dare be provocative. Even a small risk of retaliation might be safe. Schelling commented on some of Gallowis's views on the F9. A better answer lay in the interests at stake. Gallowis could not show why a nuclear attack that risked retaliation in kind could ever be rational, but intuitively he had a point when suggesting that it was still more likely to be undertaken by a government whose country had been attacked than one urged to act on behalf of an ally. Even then the potential attack would still need to be safe. Aggressor. Here Gallowis developed one of his most in 10. The pain that might be endured to eliminate America would not be endured if the prize was only France. A cost/bane. Gallowis's starting position was that a non-nuclear defense was not feasible and that limited nuclear strikes were pointless. This is why the effort needed to be put into accumulating SUV. Preparations for nuclear war and those for conventional war could not coexist. Once committed to the atom, it is impossible to draw back. This was his complaint against the U.S. administration. Emphasizing preparations for conventional war would leave Europeans vulnerable as they would be denied the best means of protection. He understood that a conventional strategy, though militarily inadequate, reduced the risk for the United States. There was therefore a divergence of strategic interests that created a crisis in NATO which could only be solved by the US fully sharing nuclear risks with its allies. It must renew the old promise of an unconditional guarantee of the security of Western Europe. Otherwise, the Europeans would have to look to their own nuclear devices. 11. How automatic should a nuclear response be in order to act as a deterrent? Gallowis veered between one proposition that automaticity was not required as the slightest possibility of a response would soothe Western Europe. Nevertheless, even a national response could never be wholly automatic, and there was always the risk with a small force that an enemy surprise attack might make one impossible. His case rested in the end not on automatic retaliation or on an unusually credible con. Generalizing the policy of national dissuasion would force the aggressor to accept the responsibility and the risks inherent in any modi. Gallowis's strategic logic led to profound and diff. General André Beaufre's methodology was different from that of Gallowis. In the early 1950s, Beaufre headed the Inter-Allied Tactical Studies Group based in Heidelberg that examined the impact of atomic weapons on military tactics and force posture. The conclusions he reached about the need for dispersal were considered so radical that they led one American observer to conclude they would necessitate review of the basic principles of land warfare. 12. He relied more on abstract model building, was unenthusiastic about massive retaliation and unconvinced by ideas of proportional deterrence. At the heart of his thought was the role played by nuclear weapons in leading to a movement away from a war strategy to a strategy of potential threat, in other words to a strategy of deterrence. The object of this strategy was to prevent an enemy power taking the decision to use armed force. The enemy's psychology was to be in effect of a calculation of the risk incurred compared to the issue at stake and of the fear engendered by the risks and uncertainties of con. 13. The strategy depended on manipulating the enemy's sense of this risk, by the non-employment of nuclear weapons through judicious exploitation of the fact that they exist. This later became the basis for McGeorge Bundy's notion of existential deterrence. Because of this, the technical qualities of weapons were of far less signing. What support could be expected on matters marginal to the superpower's own survival? Unlike Galois, Beaufort did not assume that alliances were untenable in these conditions. Deterrence was a peacetime activity and alliances did not fall apart in peacetime. But they might need strengthening, and this required increasing the risks for the potential enemy. So he ended up at a similar place to Galois. The best way to add to the enemy's risk was a series of nuclear forces. Also, by generalizing the danger in this way, a new form of solidarity would result. The Allies would have to work together. Multiple decision centers would introduce a new source of uncertainty for the enemy. This multilateral deterrence would be more stable than if only two opponents were involved. As he explained in a 1965 article, different methods must simultaneously be used to keep the enemy's mind in that state of uncertainty which alone can render deterrence effective. Thus, to enable several methods of deterrence to be used simultaneously, there must be several centers of decision. The basic conclusion is contrary to American policies. In fact, these have for too long focused upon the stabilization of the nuclear threshold, although it is today so stable that it needs to be, so to speak, destabilized to restore its deterrent effect. 14. Beaufort could not even demonstrate how a multiplicity of decisions made nuclear use more likely, but only that it complicated the enemy's calculations. The impact was felt through the psychology of uncertainty rather than the logic of certainty. This was a threat that left a lot to chance, based on the danger of a situation getting out of control. Beaufort was motivated by a desire to increase alliance solidarity rather than compensate for its fragmentation. However, it was not clear how this approach would contribute to solidarity. For example, a potential role of a French nuclear force spoke of it as a detonator of the American nuclear arsenal. The threat, according to Raymond Aron, though not explicit, of using the French atomic force as a detonator is its sole conceivable deterrence function within the framework of the present Atlantic Organization. 15. Many in the U.S. administration certainly felt this to be the motivation behind the developing French force, although neither Beaufort's nor Galois's arguments depended on such a precise causal relationship. For example, Enthoven and Smith thought it involved a curious piece of logic: the Americans can't be trusted to retaliate against the Soviets for attacking France, or Great Britain, therefore, we will have our own independent nuclear force to cause the Americans to retaliate against the Soviet Union for a French, or British, attack on the Soviet Union. 16. The most sophisticated discussion of the detonator concept, as was often the case, was by Glenn Snyder, who himself did not favor it. He noted two types of triggering. An emotional trigger might result from a Russian counter-force attack to disarm a European country of its nuclear capacity. The shock to the US might be strong enough to provoke a nuclear response. An attritional trigger might result from the Soviet expenditure of nuclear weapons in a disarming, in particular without assigning. 17. It was hard to imagine any conditions in which the Americans would allow their use of nuclear weapons to be decided by the force of events rather than by careful deliberation. All that could be said was that the existence of independent nuclear forces raised the stakes of a con. In 1966, de Gaulle decided to withdraw French forces from NATO's integrated military command. Combined with its earlier withdrawal from Algeria, the basic tenets that had underpinned French defense commitments since the end of the Second World War were undergoing a massive adjustment. No longer would participation in a joint military effort to counter a Soviet attack be automatic. General d'Armée Charles Ailleret argued that it was not possible to plan for war against a single, Welda. The world situation offers us a spectacle of such disorder, such agitation, such development, that while it is hardly possible to identify anywhere precisely the potential threats to our own country, it is also impossible to rely on the present balances of power in order to forecast the future. Meanwhile, NATO was too constricting. It atrophied the nation's independent means of defense. The determination of the Americans to keep the alliance under their control made it unresponsive to European interests. the propensity of the Americans to get themselves into. For Ailerat, assignee. Deterrent purposes, no matter who needed deterring or for what reasons. Those missiles would not be orientated in only one direction but be capable of intervening everywhere, or as we say in our military jargon, at every point of the compass, 2 azimuths, dot. Such a system for France would wield the maximum power afforded by its national resources and, handled with as much sang-froid as determination, should enable it, by dissuasion, to avoid certain major wars and, if it cannot, then to take part in them under the best conditions, in short, a system which, during future crises that may rock the world, would place France in a position where she could freely determine her own destiny. 18. There were 3 main. At least part of the other superpower was apparently to be included, but how? And what about her attempts at hegemony, particularly over Eastern Europe? At the center of it all, France was to be the focal point for the new Europe, but the problem of inconsistencies between the national interests of France and the more general interests of her neighbors was not followed up. The consequences of de Gaulle's policy were the opposite to those intended. Germany gained a leadership position within NATO while the French efforts only divided Western Europe, potentially facilitating Soviet hegemony. The second. Nor were they ever able to explain how they could present a credible nuclear deterrent to azimuths, especially given problems of warning time and vulnerability. The consequence of these two. The more planners concentrated on scenarios which would touch upon France's NATO obligations, the more Gaullist notions of a digne. In the standard NATO scenario of a Soviet attack on West Germany, France might feel safe. The maturing of France's nuclear capabilities led to several notable shifts in the country's nuclear strategy. In the 1960s, the French nuclear arsenal consisted solely of air-delivered kiloton bombs. By the early 1970s, it had evolved into a triad, the third country to possess one after the US and USSR, that included megaton weapons as well as the short-range missiles allocated to the French army, which was responsible for the defense of the national territory and its approaches. The French military presence in West Germany mandated, in effect, that this territory be considered part of France's vital interests to be protected with nuclear weapons. In March 1976, General Guy Mary introduced the concept of extended sanctuarization, to allow us to intervene with the whole or part of our forces throughout the entire zone where the security of this country may be immediately threatened. Such a concept recognized a possible need to participate in the forward battle area, from which it would be extremely dangerous to remain aloof. A battle of the frontiers would result only if the forward area crumbled too quickly, perhaps because the French were unable to make up their minds on intervention or were impeded in doing so by the enemy. 19. Within French military circles there was considerable debate about the purpose of tactical nuclear weapons and their relationship to the strategic arsenal. For some French military thinkers, tactical nuclear weapons would be best employed for war. Instead, they would be used to demonstrate that the nature of the character of French defense policy, specie. Yet this policy raised the prospect that prior to reaching the French forces, NATO's conventional deterrent would be weakened to such an extent that the alliance might be forced into an early nuclear escalation, a possibility that was not in France's interest. From 1977 to 1982, French policy switched to one of greater participation in, and support to, NATO operations as a second echelon reinforcement. After 1983, the French military were expected to play a more sine 20. Another feature associated with the growth of French strategic nuclear capabilities was the vast increase in the ability to cause such a sine. Whereas there had previously been an emphasis on demographic targeting, under the presidency of Giscard d'Estaing a new emphasis was placed on economic and leadership targeting, based in large part on the belief that the Soviets were not necessarily deterred by threats against their population centers. The destruction of some 40% of Soviet industry to the west of the Urals and roughly 50 cities was regarded as SUV for deterrence. In 1980, Prime Minister Raymond Barre used the American term assured destruction in relation to the level of destruction France could in. However, French capabilities never allowed counter-force to be considered a viable option. Similarly, for both economic and strategic reasons, France developed neither missile nor civil defenses, just 21 until the late 1970s, when the question of long-range nuclear forces based in Europe re-emerged as an issue. The question of European nuclear options remained dormant, with the United States recognizing that undue pressure on its allies on this matter could well be counterproductive, and most allies preferring to live with the known uncertainties of the U.S. nuclear guarantee than with the political and strategic uncertainties of nuclear independence. The French and British both found the diplomatic Baini 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 preventing any formal return to the integrated military organization. 1718. Tom Schelling, Nuclears, General Guy Mary, copyright the author, email. This prospect would get alarm bells ringing not only in the Soviet bloc but also elsewhere in NATO. To try to square this circle, the Kennedy administration explored a scheme that had been devised under the Eisenhower administration for a multilateral force. This would be partly manned and owned by Europeans but without actually sharing control. In the end, this was a circle that could not be squared. West Germany's sensitive geographical and political position had given it a determining in. Hori. Solidarity with the West was reinforced by fear and loathing of the East, particularly in view of the continued occupation of a portion of the country. Through the 1950s and much of the 1960s, Germany insisted that NATO and the Warsaw Pact faced each other on German soil. If Moscow decided on expansion, West Germany would be the most likely country to be invaded. For political reasons, it was Div. The Chief of Staff of the Bundeswehr, Hans Arotiger, argued for a preemptive strike and attack with armored forces that would strike out from the inner German border through East German terrain to Magdeburg on the Elbe, and perhaps even further eastwards. Regardless, battles were expected to be fought on German soil and the consequences would be devastating, particularly if the alliance resorted to tactical nuclear weapons. In order to make German rearmament more palatable, the Bonn government agreed in 1954 not to manufacture in its territory any atomic weapons. The fear of West Germany reneging on this pledge, combined with a resurgent nationalism, was an unavoidable factor in alliance deliberations, even without any tangible evidence that such fears were justy. Commit openly to nuclear acquisition, this would cause a crisis within NATO. These fears, however unrealistic they may have been, almost certainly worked in Bonn's favor as it argued for more in. Nor was it clear that this self-denial could endure in. Countries without the most modern and only really decisive armament could be considered relegated to the second league of powers. Such a position would be contrary to Germany's size and residual geopolitical signing. For these reasons, and despite renouncing the production of a nuclear arsenal, West Germany continued to seek a nuclear role of some sort after it joined NATO in 1955. West German leaders needed to show that they could in. By this time it had become apparent that the forward to the Weser Lech line. This meant abandoning large portions of West German territory to the Soviet invaders, with the aim of recovering it later but only following widespread nuclear use. The natural West German preference was always to avoid giving up territory and to resist a Soviet invasion as far forward as possible. Even when, in 1963, NATO's main defense line was moved closer to the inner German border, there was still no con. There were therefore two related issues: how to sustain deterrence and the German contribution to this task. Franz Joseph Strauss, the formidable defense minister from 1956 to 1962, was convinced that deterrence was vital and Germany had a role to play in sustaining it. He began in his post believing that this was best done by arming West German units with tactical nuclear weapons and stationing them near the inner German border. At a December 1956 NATO meeting,
Okay. Now it should be working. Let me put desktop. This is so confusing. Okay. There we go. Yay!
Yeah.
Now it's not a muted stream anymore. How do I change this? Not a muted stream. Speaking stream.
Were you able to actually pay attention to your homework while doing that?
Yeah, I mean,
I mean, I was.
I like listening to it
Mhm.
a lot better than like reading it.
Yeah. Seems
I
like
had
somebody's
like,
telling you a story instead of like
yeah.
reading.
Oh my god. And then I get distracted. I like doing things while doing it, so I was like, well, might as well
Yeah.
stream it if I'm gonna listen to it. Oh my god. This worked a lot better than I thought it would.
Yeah.
I thought I would have to do like a lot more passes, but it seems like it should be good with the next one. It's just all these stray blocks.
You can mine them down after, it'll be fine. I mean, you have to get rid of some, right?
Yeah, the one that's in the air. And then they'll run into him and then stop the machine. And I'm like, and then I go in there and I explode. Oh my god, I didn't know it would like linger like that. Especially you can't
Yeah.
on the ground you can't see it. Or like you don't even see the particles. You just start taking damage. I got low then too. Oh my god. Started flinging shit every whatever. I survived. What are you doing right now?
Trapdoors.
My infinite trapdoor maze.
I need my topper trapdoors to make my build. I did not
Yeah,
realize how
has to be
expensive a
weathered.
resource this would be. I didn't know you couldn't stone color them anymore.
Yeah. What? Oh yeah, it's the ingots.
Yeah.
You gotta drown farm it.
I know, you can still rob a trial chamber
Mm,
and just get the base blocks from there.
true.
Expensive thing is more the time investment.
You have to weather it the right way.
Yeah.
I'm gonna attach him to this machine. I think it needs a better name than Blastmaster 2000. It needs like a cooler name.
Not got any ideas.
Hmm. All I can think about is nuclear. I mean,
Yeah, I was gonna say, wonder if you would go with something nuclear because of your
I got my
background
motifs.
track. And you got your motifs.
I
and
think it's
shit.
fitting.
Yeah.
Hmm. Let's think of some nuclear terms. Kind of lags back. Hmm. I guess it's less nuclear. It was I mean, it was a Cold War. It was a war game. And it was called Able Archer.
Able Archer?
Yeah, I lost that observer. I think that might be a good name.
Yeah.
Oh, shit. Okay, we're good.
What happened? Okay.
I broke the wrong block first. And it started going off, and I almost lost my precious, precious slime. I got it back, though. My slime.
It's so funny. And these two write me like nice messages saying like, "Oh, I appreciate you. Wow." And I get some gay ass looks, and then we're lying up the top of your base.
It's fitting.
Yeah.
They knew it was coming, probably. I mean, well, I don't know.
Probably.
Like, I don't know what
David
Blue
Allen
assumes.
has something to do with bases
Yeah,
for a while.
but like, they know the obsidian floor. They knew I drained the water, so
Yeah.
probably.
Oh, did you drink the water?
I drained the top of the lake, and then I was like, I have too much work to do, and so I left it just
Yeah,
open.
but we don't know if they saw it.
I'm pretty sure. I mean, Blue knew about the obsidian platform, obsidian ceiling, and probably came back to it, and we're gonna do something with it within the next few days.
Yeah.
Maybe
Blue
not
also
though.
does keep secrets though, so
Yeah, but
surprisingly,
it
which
was
is interesting.
more like the interpretation, like Blue's interpretation.
Yeah.
And Blue's just as much of a snooper, so
Yeah.
Blue does keep secrets pretty well.
Sometimes.
Has there been an instance where they haven't?
Hmm? Trying to remember.
FE4 just won in Fortnite? FE4's hearing the lore? Forgot about that? Whatever. Good job winning in Fortnite, man. Proud of you. I should get the Goku skin.
Can't really think of an incident.
Yeah.
Because I'm like, anything that happened in like when we were still beating with Legion, it's like I don't know how much I really told Blue back then. I was pretty like there were some things that was like Blue was talking to me at the same time they were talking to me or something, some things like that. But it's like all that info could have been like they found on their own.
Mm.
And when talking about my uh when I set those traps at spawn for Mari, Blue had apparently asked if Mari wanted to know.
Mm. Yeah, I guess between teammates it's different.
Yeah, I think it is different. I think first thing we do for building is re-terraform the top.
Yeah. Oh my god.
Just so we can't be watched while doing it.
Yeah.
You don't have to do water or any of that, of course, but because it's gonna get removed again anyway. But
Yeah, just keep the
it's the landscape.
make it something different.
Yeah.
Oh, it'd be so fun to make it like a winter landscape. But
Hot biome.
yeah, you make it like artificially.
Yeah.
It's just a shit ton of work.
I don't know if it'd be too bad. Actually.
It's just the snow.
The issue
And
would just be more like the coloring of like leaves and stuff, I think.
yeah, I think that doesn't matter too much.
That
Like, as long
wasn't
as
too
the
bad to get.
message
Just,
gets across. Holy shit! Why'd I take so much damage?
I'd like to keep the original topography, but changing the
Mm.
blocks is fine with me. I have that schematic at the top of it.
Yes. Give me back my observers. Those are mine. Oh my god. Oh, I've destroyed my observer. Yeah, destroyed that one too. Okay, cool.
Oh, those books I asked you and Marion for, I need them tomorrow, pretty much.
Okay.
I finish up Redstone tomorrow. We ideally start tomorrow night, late tomorrow night,
Okay.
depending if concrete's up and running. We could reduce the count, maybe reduce the number to 4 instead of 6.
Yeah, that
Might
might
be
be
easier.
easier. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll tell Mary that.
Hopefully this doesn't take 3 hours again. I don't think I'm finishing this tonight. Lord have mercy.
Want me to come over and help?
Yeah, I just need to run this, but oh my god. I don't know if it's gonna take as long.
Deep slate.
How true. Oh my god. Guessing I'll take another. Doesn't seem like that much, but it took me. What has it been? 3 hours 30.
Yeah. You have to take that long sponging break, though.
Oh, true. Yeah.
Make a difference if it's done now or done tomorrow. So, your call.
Yeah, probably tomorrow because I gotta be up at 9. So.
Yeah, do it tomorrow then.
And then I have a weird online discussion, and then I can start it at 2. Yay! Just carve this out so I can build it and run it. Okay, I'm gonna end stream. Go to bed. Yay.
Okay. Night.
Good night.